The Christmas table was set with all the care that usually marked our end-of-year gatherings. The red tablecloth my wife had bought when the children were small, the dishes inherited from my mother, the glasses that were only used on special occasions. The smell of roasting turkey filled the whole house, and for the first time in a long time, I had made an effort to make everything perfect. Not for myself, but because I always believed that deep down, Christmas kept our family together. I didn't. Know that that night, I would be the main target of the laughter, scorn, and cruelty that my own children had learned to find funny. As soon as I sat down at the table, I noticed the glances they exchanged. First came the whisper, then the muffled laughter, and then the comments began to slip out, each one sharper than the last. One of them looked at my shirt, an old but well-cared-for piece, and asked if I'd bought it at the Museum of Lost Clothes. Another, holding his cell phone, showed a photo to his sister, and they both laughed again, too loudly to be unintentional. "Dad, you need to update yourself," she said. "Your look, it's like you stepped straight out of the 80s. I forced a smile, trying to take it lightly, trying to pretend it wasn't affecting me, but it was. It was hitting me hard. While they continued laughing, talking about my age, my lack of style, my unfamiliarity with technology, I realized that each word carried a different weight in that environment lit by flashing lights. They weren't just joking, they were mocking me. And the saddest part is that, at that moment, I realized that perhaps it wasn't the first time they had done this amongst themselves when I wasn't around. The sarcasm came too easily, too quickly, as if it were a habit cultivated over time. As if, for them, I had become a kind of family joke. I tried to join the conversation, asking about their jobs, their plans for the coming year, but every time I opened my mouth, I received a curt reply, a short phrase, or more laughter. At one point, one of them said, "Dad, you need to stop with these old-fashioned thoughts. Nobody lives like that anymore." He said it with that tone that mixes mockery with pity. It was as if I were an outdated object, someone stuck in a time that no longer exists. And the worst part? They said this in front of their grandchildren, who just watched everything in silence, learning without understanding, repeating actions without realizing it. As dinner progressed, I felt my heart clench in a way I hadn't felt in years. Not because they were laughing at me, I'd endured that before, but because it was Christmas. The night of love, reconciliation, and forgiveness. And yet, there I was, sitting at the head of the table, surrounded by people I brought into the world, whom I nurtured, educated, protected, and who now acted as if I were a burden, a nuisance, a pathetic figure who needed to be tolerated simply because I was part of the family. My smile, though firm, trembled inside. My throat burned with each unspoken word. The feeling of humiliation didn't come from anything explicit, but from the whole experience. The gaze that lingers a second longer, the laughter that erupts the moment you enter the room, the whispered comment that's clearly about you. It was as if I were invisible, and at the same time exposed. All of this continued for long minutes that felt like hours. I tried to stay calm, tried to act as if nothing was happening, tried to convince myself it was just a poorly placed joke. But then one of them said something that pierced my chest like a knife. "Dad, you take everything so seriously because you have nothing else to do with your life." The table fell silent for a second, and then more laughter erupted. And it was in that specific instant, in that second frozen in time, that something inside me simply changed. I took a deep breath. I faced each of them. I felt a strange serenity wash over me, as if one door had closed inside me and, at the same time, another had opened. They thought they knew me. They thought they knew where I was weak, where I was vulnerable, how far they could go without me reacting. But they had no idea, absolutely no idea, of the weight I carried, of the decisions I had silently made over the past few years, of the choices I had made without ever mentioning them to anyone. And then, while everyone was still laughing, I calmly stood up from the table. I didn't slam my hand on the table. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. My voice came out low, firm, and sharp as ice. "You think you know who I am," I said. "But today you're going to discover what you never wanted to see." They looked at each other, confused. The laughter faded. Silence filled the room. And then I concluded, they thought they knew me. That night I decided to show them what nobody knew. Before that Christmas night, before the laughter that cut my heart like thin blades, there was a story behind me that no one there seemed to remember, or perhaps they had never truly noticed. The truth is, my life had always been made of simplicity, hard work, and silent choices I made to support the same family that now mocked me so easily. While they grew up, believing that food simply appeared on the table and that the bills paid themselves, I was there, day after day, moving my tired body so that nothing would be lacking. I was never a man of luxury. My childhood was poor, but full of dignity. I learned early on that to survive, it was necessary to work more than to complain. At 12, I was already helping my father with heavy labor. At 15, I started working formally, getting down to business before many of my colleagues even knew what responsibility was. From then on, my life was a series of jobs that demanded strength, patience, resilience, and above all, sacrifice. When my children were born, I made a silent promise that they would have a better life than mine. I would do whatever it took, and I did. I worked as a bricklayer's assistant, construction worker, machine operator, night watchman, truck loader. There was a period when I had 2 jobs and barely slept 3 hours a night. Even so, I didn't complain. I had a purpose: to put my children on an easier, more comfortable, more dignified path. I remember the nights I'd come home so tired my hands would tremble. Sometimes I'd sit on the edge of the bed, take off my dirty boots, and feel like collapsing. But then I'd hear a giggle in the next room, a door slamming, the sound of toys scattered on the floor, and that was enough to get me up and get everything ready again for the next day. My children were too young to understand what I was doing for them, but I always believed that when they grew up they would, and maybe, just maybe, they would respect me. There were times when money was so tight that I would spend weeks eating the same cheap lunch just to be able to pay their school fees. There were moments when I refused invitations from colleagues because I couldn't afford it, preferring to say I wasn't in the mood. There was also that time I sold my motorcycle, my only means of transportation, to pay for a necessary surgery for one of them. I never told them, never demanded it, never threw it in their faces. I believed that a father's love didn't need to be displayed. It just needed to be lived. But as the years went by, I realized something that hurt more than any physical exhaustion. My children were growing up and, little by little, creating a distance not only emotional but moral. They started talking about me as if I were someone outdated, someone who hadn't evolved, someone stuck in a time they considered shameful. Everything I suffered, everything I carried alone, became invisible to them. The sacrifices became stories no one wanted to hear. Hard work became a joke. Simplicity became synonymous with failure. I watched my children build careers, buy cars, travel, achieve what I always wanted for them. And seeing that should have filled me with pride, and it did, in part. But along with the pride came something else, something more bitter, the feeling that in their rise I had been left behind, not as a father, but as a human being. They never asked about my sleepless nights. They never wanted to know about the pain I carried on my back. They never wanted to hear about the day I almost fainted at work from exhaustion. They never asked how I managed to keep the house standing, even in the darkest moments. To them, I was just the father, the figure who exists, who sustains, who endures, who doesn't feel, who doesn't collapse, who doesn't complain. And then, as if invisibility wasn't enough, came the judgment, the easy laughter, the sarcasm, the criticism disguised as advice. They didn't understand, nor did they try to understand, that if my hands were calloused, it was because each callus had a name, theirs. If I had old clothes, it was because I prioritized buying. School supplies, shoes, medicine, courses, opportunities for them. If I didn't have luxuries, it was because I had a family. Even so, even after everything, I never demanded recognition. I never asked for applause. I never wanted them to call me a hero. I just wanted something simple, something that doesn't cost money, but is worth more than any fortune. All I ever wanted was respect. Respect for the man I was, for the father I tried to be, for the difficult choices I made without ever involving them. Respect for the weight I carried on my shoulders while they studied, dreamed, and built the future I worked so hard to make possible. Respect for myself, not for what I had, but for what I did. And on that Christmas night, amidst laughter and scornful glances, what hurt the most wasn't what they said. What hurt the most was realizing that, to them, I was never anything more than someone convenient, someone who served their purpose, but who could now be ignored, as if my value had expired. Little did they know that the story they thought they knew about me was only half of what existed. There was something I never told, something I carried for decades, something no one there imagined. And that night, for the first time, I felt that perhaps the time had come to show them who I really was, and what I had built in silence. The conversation had taken an uncomfortable turn some time ago. The laughter always followed some comment about my clothes, my old-fashioned way of speaking, my difficulty with technology. I had already swallowed so much at that table that my chest felt tight, as if someone were pushing the air out of me. Still, I tried to keep the mood light. After all, it was Christmas. I repeated this to myself like a mantra, a desperate attempt not to ruin the night for anyone. But they seemed determined to test my limits. It was after the second round of desserts that the conversation took a different turn. One of my sons, the oldest, the one in whom I always placed so much hope, raised his glass to make a toast. He never makes toasts. Never. When I saw him preparing to speak, I even felt a little warmth in my chest, that childlike feeling of expectation. I thought for a second that perhaps it would be a beautiful moment. Perhaps he would say thank you. Perhaps he would acknowledge something. Perhaps. But no. He flashed a crooked smile, the kind that betrays that malice is disguised as humor, and said, I wanted to raise a toast to my father, the only man I know who managed to grow old this long without achieving anything. The table erupted in laughter. Loud laughter, unbridled laughter, laughter devoid of affection, only cruelty, laughter that pierced my heart. I froze. I felt my hands trembling under the table. He continued, lulled by his brother's smiles. Guys, let's be honest. Dad keeps repeating those stories about effort and sacrifice, but look at him now. No future, no plan, no direction, literally stuck in life. He's become almost a burden, and we're the ones who should be worried. Another of my children added, in a tone that mixed irony with disguised disgust. If it were up to his father, we'd be the ones taking care of him, because you can't expect him to be prepared for anything, can you? The youngest daughter, who had always been more direct than she should have been, delivered the final blow. Dad, don't take it the wrong way, okay? But sometimes it feels like you live in a world that ended 30 years ago. You don't keep up with anything. You don't understand anything. You don't do anything. We love you, but it's hard to pretend everything's all right. She said that with a smile that suggested she believes saying we love you gives permission to say anything cruel, as if love justified humiliating someone in front of their entire family. The grandchildren watched, not fully understanding but sensing the atmosphere, and that tore something apart inside me, because children learn by observing. They learn from how adults treat each other, and there, faced with that grotesque spectacle, they were learning that I, their grandfather, was a laughingstock, an example of what not to be, a flawed, outdated, ridiculous man. I tried to swallow. I tried to breathe. I tried to pretend it was all just a joke, as they always say when they do something too cruel to admit. But at that moment, sitting at the head of the table I paid for myself, in that house I built with my own hands, I realized it wasn't a joke. It wasn't humor. It wasn't lighthearted. It was contempt, pure contempt. A contempt that had been building up for years, but now it was there, blatant, without any shame. My children spoke of me as if I weren't present, as if I were a shadow, a ghost, A piece of old furniture that clutters the living room, but that no one has the courage to throw away. I felt a pain so deep it was almost physical, as if something had ripped open inside my chest. The older man raised his glass again and added, "Anyway, Dad, thanks for trying, right? In your own limited way. But let's raise a toast to us who are trying to build a real future." New laughs. That was the moment. The exact moment the world stopped around me. I looked at each face at that table. Faces of people I raised, people I supported, people I protected from the cold, from hunger, from insecurity, people I defended even when they were wrong, people for whom I got up at dawn, for whom I took out loans, for whom I gave up my youth, my dreams, and often even my dignity. And there they were, laughing at me, laughing at my life, laughing at my choices, laughing at the man I've become, not realizing that if they have everything they have today, it's because I was there in the background, supporting their every step without asking for anything in return. I took a deep breath. I felt my hands stop trembling. A strange calmness came over me, the kind of calm that arises when the pain has gone beyond its limit and transforms into clarity. It was as if a curtain had been drawn back before my eyes. I saw clearly that the family I had protected so much didn't know me. They knew nothing of my real life. They didn't know the man I had become away from their eyes. They didn't know the secrets I kept. They didn't know the battles I had won in silence. They didn't know what I had built without speaking, without showing, without boasting. They thought I was a failure. They thought I had no future. They thought I was a burden. They thought my old age was a source of shame. Little did they know that I had a brighter future than they imagined, that I had built something none of them even suspected, that while they called me outdated, I was working silently, secretly accumulating something that would change not only the course of that night, but the course of all their lives. I placed the napkin on the table and stood up slowly. A heavy silence fell suddenly, and there, firm, resolute, without raising my voice, I said, "Enough. It's time for you to know the truth." After the last joke, after the venomous toast, after the laughter that echoed like a slap in the face, something inside me simply stopped. It wasn't just pain anymore. It wasn't just sadness anymore. It was as if a key had been turned inside. I no longer wanted to argue. I didn't want to shout. I didn't want to justify myself. Suddenly, all I wanted was one very simple thing: to put the truth before them. Cold, clear, unquestionable. I slowly placed the napkin beside the plate. My fingers, which had been trembling a moment before, now felt steady. My breathing, which had been short and heavy, was suddenly calm, deep, and controlled. I could feel my heart beating, no longer in despair, but with determination. The chair slid back slightly as I stood up. The sound of it scraping against the ceramic floor cut through the festive atmosphere like a dry scratch on a vinyl record. Some people looked up immediately. One of my sons was still laughing when he saw me standing and tried to hide it by adjusting his glass in front of him. My youngest daughter gave a half smile as if to say, "There, now he's offended." Nobody there expected anything different. In their minds, I would grumble about anything, make a scene, maybe blurt out a hurt phrase, lock myself in my room, or go out to the backyard to cool off. That's how they knew me, or they thought they did. One of them, somewhat embarrassed, said, "Calm down, Dad, we're just kidding." Another added, "Oh, don't take it so seriously. It's Christmas, it gets boring like that." I looked at each one of them, one by one, not with anger, not with fury. I looked as someone who had finally seen what I hadn't wanted to see for years. There were grown children there, well-dressed, with expensive cell phones, watches gleaming on their wrists, talking about investments, trips, projects, but completely blind to the man standing before them. I didn't respond to the provocation. I didn't lecture. I didn't return the humiliation. I simply let the silence speak for me for a few moments. The sound of cutlery clattering against plates faded. The laughter slowly died away, like a candle extinguished in a draft. Even the children, who had previously been talking loudly and playing without restraint, fell silent, realizing that something different was happening. My wife, sitting across the table, looked at me with a mixture of concern and bewilderment. She knew me well enough to know that my silence was unusual. So, with the same serenity of someone making a final decision, I said, "Come with me." Just that. 3 words. 3 simple words, but laden with a weight that no one could understand at the time. My oldest son frowned. "What do you mean, Dad? Now?" I didn't repeat myself. I didn't explain. I didn't ask. I didn't beg. I just stared at everyone in silence, waiting. My expression said what my mouth didn't need to say. It wasn't an invitation. It was almost a summons. The room seemed to shrink. The lights twinkling on the Christmas tree continued their mechanical flashing, but suddenly that glow lost all its charm. The festive atmosphere was swallowed by a strange tension. Someone swallowed hard. Another cleared their throat. One of the grandchildren whispered, "Is Grandpa angry?" My wife, still confused, asked, "What's going on? Where do you want to go?" I turned my face towards her and replied firmly, "Just come, all of you." I used a tone I almost never use. It wasn't aggressive, but it also left no room for discussion. It was the voice of someone who had spent their entire life giving in, swallowing their pride, overlooking things, and now, for some reason, had decided to stop. The atmosphere changed. They felt it. Everyone felt it. One of the sons tried to lighten the mood with another joke. "Oh no, here comes a sermon. We went a little overboard with the jokes, and now we're all going to court." Nobody laughed. Not even him. His words hung in the air, falling like a stone seconds later. Gradually, they began to get up. First, my wife. She adjusted her chair, carefully placed her napkin on the table as if afraid of making a noise. Then the youngest daughter pushed her plate forward, picked up her cell phone, locked the screen, and put it in her pocket. The eldest stood up slowly, stretching his back, with an impatient sigh, as if he were being forced to interrupt. Something important. The grandchildren exchanged curious glances, trying to understand if this would end in a scolding, a serious conversation, tears, or nothing at all. One of the children held the doll in their hand as if needing courage. Another hugged their mother's arm, and while everyone was settling in, the whole room went silent. The sound of the television in the background, which until then had been showing some Christmas special, seemed distant. The wall clock, which had always been there, marking the hours with its discreet ticking, now seemed to tick louder. The lights on the tree continued to blink, but their glow, once warm, now seemed cold. My curiosity began to grow. It was obvious. One of the sons whispered to the other, "What is he going to do?" "I don't know, man. I think he's going to say something, Vent. I don't know. Is he going to leave?" "Where to?" the other replied with a certain disdain. "He doesn't even have anywhere to go." Those last words reached my ears. I heard them. I understood. But I didn't react. Because at that point, something within me had already transcended the pain. I was in a kind of inner silence where even the humiliation seemed small compared to what was about to happen. I made the first move toward the hallway. I didn't say anything. I didn't look back. I just started walking, with firm steps, like someone following a plan that had been decided long ago. Behind me, I felt the movement. Chairs, shuffling footsteps, sighs. As I approached the door leading to the back of the house, I heard the eldest son ask, in a somewhat irritated tone, "Dad, seriously, what are you up to?" I stopped, but I didn't turn around completely. I just said, in a low tone, without drama, without exaggeration, "You want answers about who I am? Then come and see for yourselves." Just that. More silence. More tension. Curiosity was no longer just a detail. It dominated the atmosphere. Even those who, moments before, had been laughing loudly, now had closed, suspicious expressions. My unexpected move had thrown everyone off the script they were used to following. The script where I always swallowed everything, always pretended everything was fine, always accepted being the target of the moment. They didn't know where I was taking them all that night. They didn't know what awaited them beyond that door. They didn't know that that walk through the house, simple, slow, silent, was, in fact, the beginning of a revelation that would change everything, all. And so, one after the other, they followed me. From the lavish and noisy Christmas table to a quiet hallway, heavy with a tension that no one could explain. What they had no idea about was that night, which had started as just another Christmas, where I was the butt of jokes, would end as the Christmas where everyone would discover a truth I had hidden for years. And I, who had always been treated as the burden of the family, was about to show what truly sustained each of their futures. Leaving the dining room felt like stepping into another world. The hallway leading to the garage was the same as always, narrow, lit by a yellowish light bulb that my wife kept saying needed replacing. But that night, it felt different. It felt colder, longer, quieter, as if the whole house had held its breath along with me. The first steps echoed like sharp blows on the floor. Each shoe hitting the ground made a sound that seemed louder than it should have been. Maybe because no one was saying anything. Maybe because the tension intensified everything. Maybe because, for the first time in a long time, my children were really watching me. I walked ahead, slowly but without hesitation. I could feel the movement behind me, the impatient breaths, the light shuffling of one of the grandchildren who didn't want to leave his mother's side. The air seemed to have changed temperature. In the living room there was warmth, the warmth of the lights, the food, the laughter. But there, in that hallway, there was a strange chill, as if the house itself knew that something important was about to happen and had covered itself with a layer of caution. The first to break the silence was my eldest son. "Dad, this is getting weird." His voice, once full of mockery, now had a hint of irritation mixed with nervousness. He tried to laugh after the sentence, but no one joined in. The youngest daughter came right behind, whispering to her sister-in-law, "It must be another one of his dramas, always making a scene when he gets hurt." The sister-in-law replied with a whisper, "I don't know. He's acting differently today." Another of my sons, the middle one, grumbled, "I bet he's going to lecture us. It'll be the same old speech. I sacrificed myself. I did everything for you, blah, blah, blah." The mockery was still there, but now weak, insecure, almost automatic. They tried to maintain the role they knew, the role of the one in control, of the one with superiority, of the, one too grown up to take their father seriously. But the glances they exchanged didn't lie. There was discomfort, there was doubt, there was even a subtle kind of fear not of me, but of what I was about to reveal. As we moved forward, the sound of our footsteps created a strange rhythm. It was as if we were all walking to the beat of an invisible clock, counting something we didn't yet know. The walls seemed narrower, and the shadows longer. Every few meters, someone looked back, or to the sides, as if expecting me to be preparing some unpleasant surprise. The grandchildren, always curious, began to whisper, "Where is Grandpa taking us? Why in the dark? Are we going to play?" Their mother, not knowing what to answer, simply put a finger to her lips and murmured, "Shh, just keep going." The eldest son, the same one who made the cruel toast, put his hands in his pockets and said, "Dad, seriously, what was the point of all this? Couldn't we have talked about it there? Everyone's tired. The food's getting cold." I paused for a second. I turned my face slightly, without looking at him fully, and said, "If you had any respect, you wouldn't have said what you said. And honestly, certain things are not said at a Christmas dinner table." When I finished the sentence, the hallway grew even quieter, as if the walls absorbed my words to prevent them from echoing. It wasn't a reprimand. It was a reminder, an open wound. We continued walking. With each step, the atmosphere changed more and more. I could feel that they were trying to interpret my intentions. The irritation lessened, the arrogant certainty evaporated, and in its place arose something else, distrust. The youngest daughter murmured, "Why in the garage? What's in there?" Her husband, who had been silent until then, replied, "I've never seen him act like that before. Maybe he's been keeping something to himself. I don't know." My middle son, always the most impulsive, blurted out, "Oh, come on. There can't be anything serious. He's probably just trying to get attention." But even he looked around with narrowed eyes, as if trying to anticipate the unexpected. The proximity to the garage door made the atmosphere even colder. There was always a chilly breeze in that area because the metal door wasn't the best in terms of sealing, but that night, it felt like the wind had a purpose. A cutting air passed down the spine of everyone who followed me. My wife even rubbed her arms to warm herself. "It's cold here," she commented softly. "He should have said what's going on," my oldest son insisted. "Perhaps it's serious," someone replied. From that point on, it wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was pure tension. I could hear the accelerated breathing. I could notice hesitant footsteps. I could feel the unease growing behind me like a wave about to crash. And the truth is, for the first time in my life, I let them feel it. For decades, I was the safe haven, the peacemaker, the buffer against conflict, always smoothing things over so that no one would feel uncomfortable. But that night, I allowed the discomfort to exist. Finally, we reached the door that led to the garage. A sturdy, old wooden door that I had installed myself years ago. The cold doorknob reflected a bit of the yellowish light from the hallway. That simple, commonplace object now seemed like the threshold between the story they had invented about me and the truth I was about to reveal. Behind me, the silence was almost absolute. That's when I heard the question that was on everyone's mind. Why in the garage? What's in there? The question was asked by my daughter, but it resonated as if each of them had asked it at the same time. I touched the doorknob, but I didn't turn it yet. I just stood there for a moment, my hand resting on the cold metal, and without turning around, I replied, "There is the part of my life that you never wanted to see." No response, no jokes, no laughter, no snide remarks. Nothing. The entire hallway held its breath. Then, with a slow movement, I pushed the door open, and a smell of cold metal and the past began to escape, announcing that the revelation was only beginning. The garage was always a place that no one in the house paid much attention to. For them, it was just a storage space for old things, dusty tools, cardboard boxes with objects from the past, leftover construction materials, a few childhood mementos that no longer fit on the shelves of memory. It was the clutter corner, the space where everything that didn't match the house ended up being thrown. And curiously, it was precisely there that I chose to keep the most important part of my life. When the door opened, the hallway light flooded the garage in a rectangular beam, cutting through the darkness. The shadows of the tools hanging on the wall stretched out, creating strange, almost menacing shapes. I reached for the switch and turned on the fluorescent lamp, which flickered a few times before stabilizing, filling the room with a cold, bright light, with no intention of softening anything. Behind me, I could hear some grumbling. "Wow, it's still a mess here," one of them commented. "I told him to throw those things away," another added in an impatient tone. They still hadn't understood. To them, I remained the old hoarder of junk, someone who can't let go, who keeps worthless things, who clings to the past. They looked at the garage and saw only what they wanted to. See, disorganization, neglect, carelessness. But there, beneath the dust, lay a secret none of them could have foreseen. I walked to the back of the garage, to the corner where almost no one bothered. There was an old shelf, full of boxes, screws, half-empty paint cans, pieces of wood, and tools that I used occasionally. I placed my hand on one of the larger boxes, spent a few seconds in silence, and then began to move it away. The sound of dragging echoed across the concrete floor. One of my daughters commented, still trying to take everything in a light-hearted way. "Dad, if you brought us here to show us that you need to organize this, you could have just asked. We could have hired a moving company and taken everything apart." She didn't finish the sentence. Because when I moved the large box and then two smaller ones, something started to appear behind them. Something that didn't fit with the idea of old mess they had in mind. A dark metal rectangle embedded in the wall, a safe. For a few seconds, nobody said anything, as if the brain needed time to process what the eyes were seeing. Silence filled the garage in such a way that you could almost hear everyone's heart beating. "What is that?" a voice asked behind me. Another, more direct one. Is it a safe? My wife stepped forward, incredulous. How long has this been here? I turned sideways, just enough to face some of them. Their faces displayed a mixture of shock, confusion, and a little fear. It was as if, suddenly, I had become someone they no longer recognized. One of my sons, the middle one, gave a nervous little laugh. Oh no, you're kidding. The older one, however, didn't laugh. He crossed his arms and spoke in a tone that tried to be rational but betrayed an evident anxiety. Dad, what's this? Since when do you have a safe in the garage? The question hung in the air. Since when have you had this? It was the question everyone wanted to ask. The question that carried behind it a second one. What else have you hidden from us? I rested my hand on the cold metal of the safe. I felt its rigidity, its solidity, the coldness that contrasted with the warmth of what I carried inside. How many times in the solitude of the early morning had I leaned against it, thinking of the day when all this would cease to be a secret? How many nights, tired of the routine, had I come to the garage and stood for a few minutes before it, as if conversing with an old, silent friend? I took a deep breath. This thing here, I began, didn't just appear yesterday. It wasn't installed this month. It wasn't put here by chance. They looked at each other. Their eyes searched for clues. They sought memories. They doubted their own memory. How could something that size have been there for so long without anyone noticing? The truth is, for years, they never paid close attention to my life, much less to my space. Anything that was Dad's thing was automatically ignored. I must have been here thousands of times, one of the sons commented, shocked. How come I've never seen this safe before? The answer was simple. Because nobody expected me to be capable of keeping secrets. To them, I was predictable, simple, transparent, controllable. And now, a vault silently revealed that perhaps I was much more than the caricature they had built in their own minds. I could have responded with irony. I could have said, "You never saw it because you never cared to see it," but I didn't want to. Turn that moment into revenge. That wasn't the time to humiliate back, but to show with facts, to show with reality. My wife took another step toward the safe. There was something different in her gaze. It wasn't mockery nor irritation. It was unease. You have a safe hidden here, and you've never told anyone? She asked slowly. I stared at her for a few seconds. It's not that I never told anyone, I replied. It's just that no one ever asked. Once again, a heavy silence fell. Since when have you had this? The question came back, this time in the voice of my eldest son, with more firmness. Dad, I'm serious. How long have you had that safe? I fixed my gaze on him. I remembered the times when he, younger, would say that I didn't understand anything about modern life, that I was naive about money, that I didn't know how to plan anything. I remembered the conversations in which he treated me almost like a financial burden, like someone who, in the future, would depend on him. At those times, I was thinking about the safe. I was thinking about what was inside. I kept thinking about the day he would find out. Now, that day had arrived. It's been longer than you think, I replied, without giving details. Much longer. Some swallowed hard. One of the grandsons, with wide eyes, asked softly, Grandpa, is there treasure in there? A part of me smiled inwardly. From a child's point of view, it all seemed like a movie, a treasure hunt, an adventure. For adults, however, it was something else entirely. It was a direct confrontation with their own arrogance. I ran my hand over the vault door, revealing an old dust mark, a faint line where my hand had touched so many times. The sound of the metal beneath my fingers, rough and firm, seemed to amplify the feeling that something big, something permanent was there. I took a deep breath. I felt the weight of years of silence resting on my shoulders, and at the same time, the lightness of finally being about to take it off. I could have kept that secret until the end. I could have written it all down on paper, in wills, in cold instructions. I could have let the truth be discovered after I was gone. But that night, at that table where I was ridiculed, something changed. They thought I had nothing. They said I was a burden. They said I had no future, that I hadn't built anything. This safe was proof that not only were they wrong, but they never really knew who the man they called father was. I gripped one of the latches tightly and turned my face to the family, gathered there in the garage, surrounded by tools, old boxes, and a silence that was almost palpable. "You always thought I was just the tired old man of the house," I said calmly, "that I didn't know how to manage money, that I had nothing, that your future was completely separate from me. Today, you're going to find out how wrong you were." I felt the air grow thicker. The expressions on their faces changed again. The mockery vanished completely. Now, what prevailed was something between astonishment, concern, and a sliver of expectation. My wife whispered and asked, "What's inside?" I looked at her, then at each of them. I knew that, after that moment, nothing would be the same. The masks would fall. The narratives they had built about me would crumble. And from then on, everyone would have to ask themselves, who is this man I've spent my life judging? I brought my face close to the safe, took one last, deep breath, and replied in a firm voice, "The truth." And with my hand still resting on the cold metal, I felt, with absolute clarity, that what was about to come out of there wasn't just money, documents, or objects. It was a revelation of who I've always been, and whom they never had the patience to meet. As my hand rested on the cold metal of the safe, a part of me drifted back in time, long before Christmas, long before the laughter, long before any humiliation, to understand why that safe was there hidden behind old tools and boxes. I had to go back decades, back to the life my children never wanted to hear about, to the stories they always interrupted with boredom or impatience, back to the journey I made silently, precisely for them. Because that safe didn't just appear out of nowhere. It had a history, an origin, a reason, and it all started with an old job. My old job, the job that almost destroyed me. I used to work in a freight warehouse many years ago, when my children were still too young to pronounce my name properly. It was a tough job, lifting huge boxes, organizing merchandise, working night shifts that robbed me of any chance of rest. The pay wasn't great, but it was honest, and that's how I made a living. The warehouse was old, stuffy in the summer and freezing in the winter. Hands were constantly cut. Backs were always tense. Bodies were always on edge. But it was there, among pallets and forklifts, that the first door to this story opened. One day, my boss called me in for a serious talk, the kind of serious tone that makes your heart race and you think you're going to be fired. But to my surprise, he said something else entirely. "You work quietly, you do more than is asked, and you never complain. I want to show you something." He opened an old room at the back of the warehouse. It was a sort of forgotten storeroom. Inside, there was a small, rusty safe, almost part of the wall. "This belonged to the previous owner," he explained. "It's empty, but it's strong. If you want, take it. It's no use to me." That was the first safe I ever owned. Not the current one, which was much bigger and more modern, but the seed of the idea. A simple object, but one that made me think, to keep, to protect, to build something in silence. I took the old safe home. Nobody cared. Nobody asked. My children were too busy growing up. My wife was too worried about the bills, and I just kept it there, as a reminder that maybe one day I would have something worth keeping. But that first safe was just the beginning. The secret project, the opportunity no one noticed. Years later, when I was already working as a machine operator in a factory, an opportunity arose to participate in a special training program. Many refused because the hours were demanding and the pay was almost non-existent. I accepted, not for the money, but for the knowledge. For weeks, I studied in the early hours of the morning while everyone else slept. I secretly took online courses, reading technical manuals as if they were novels. And little by little, I learned to operate equipment that few in the company mastered. This gave me access to projects that paid extra bonuses, jobs I did without telling anyone. The result? Small savings that grew into something bigger over time. But my children, busy with their own lives, never wanted to know. To them, my job was always the same. To me, it was a silent construction, the silent investment, The choice that nobody understood. With the bonus money and some savings I made over the years, I made a decision that no one in the family knew about. I started investing small amounts in a fund recommended by a colleague from the factory. He understood finance and taught me the basics. I studied in secret, wrote everything down in an old notebook, and did calculations during my lunch break. My oldest son even laughed at me when he saw me watching an old financial education video. "Dad, seriously? You don't even know how to use the bank properly?" I just smiled and carried on. What he didn't know was that the small deposits, month after month, year after year, were growing, slowly, silently, without fanfare, without anyone noticing. And over time, the old safe at home could no longer hold all the documents, receipts, and everything else I was compiling. So I bought a bigger one, the safe that was now in front of them, the unexpected inheritance, a letter that changed everything, but not everything. Stored there came from my work. A few years ago, I received a call I never expected. It was about my great-uncle, a man I didn't spend much time with, but who, according to him, always considered me the only one in the family who didn't get lost. He had passed away and left behind a small inheritance. It wasn't anything extravagant, nothing that would transform a life overnight, but it was enough to reinforce what I was already building, enough to make a difference, and most importantly, he left a letter with a sentence that changed everything. "Use this to protect your own, but don't say anything until you're sure they've learned the value of respect." That phrase is etched into my memory like an invisible tattoo. It was as if he could foresee my family's future, as if he knew the disrespect was coming, as if she knew that love on its own is sometimes not enough. I kept the letter inside the safe, and I never told anyone. The promise, the commitment to someone who is gone. The truth is, the safe wasn't just a place to keep money and documents. It was a silent monument to a promise I made many years ago, to someone who is no longer here. This person looked me in the eyes on a gray afternoon, when I was tired, discouraged, and worried about my children's future. She held my hands and said, "You will still be remembered, not for what you have, but for what you did. Keep going. Cherish it, protect it, and when the time is right, show who you always were." That promise became a mission. I worked during the day, saved money at night, studied in secret, and kept everything in a safe, always believing that one day those I loved would understand. But time passed. The children grew up, life went on, and respect never came. On the contrary, then came the jokes, then came the trials. Comparisons then arose, then came the looks of disdain. They didn't know that every step they took was supported by me, that everything I built was thinking of them, that the safe existed because of them. And on that Christmas night, while they laughed at my lack of a future, while they mocked my life, while they treated me like a burden, I realized I spent decades protecting the very people who were humiliating me. And that was it, exactly that made me decide the time had come. It's time to open the safe. It's time to show everything. The time has come to fulfill the promise. I took a deep breath. I returned to the present, and with my hand resting on the cold metal, I felt that every second of that story was about to explode before their eyes, and nothing, absolutely nothing, would be the same again. The silence in the garage was so heavy, you could almost feel its weight on everyone's shoulders. The cold, white light seemed to highlight every detail, the dust on the tools, the stacked boxes, the stained concrete on the floor, and, at the center of it all, that safe. Too small for the magnitude of the impact it was about to cause. My hand slid to the side of the safe, finding the panel and the old mechanical combination. I knew every number by heart. My fingers, calloused from work, turned the dial with the precision of someone who had done this dozens of times over the years. Always alone, always in the dead of night, always in silence. Tech, tech, tech. The sound of the mechanism turning cut through the silence like a clock counting down the seconds to an explosion. Each click seemed louder than the last. Behind me, No one dared move. Even the children who barely understood what was happening seemed hypnotized. I spun the dial to the first number. I stopped. I took a deep breath. I turned it all the way to the second gear. I felt that familiar resistance halfway through. I turned it to the third gear. A final internal click answered. And then, with a slight movement, I pulled the crank. The metallic sound filled the garage, a dry, deep sound, echoing inside the chests of everyone there. Clack! It was as if something invisible had been split in two at that exact moment. The masks fell. The expressions changed. Where there had been mockery, wide eyes remained. Where there had been impatience, fear of what was to come remained. Where there had been arrogance, insecurity sprouted. The vault door opened slowly, creaking softly. A scent of old paper, ink, metal, and time escaped from within. It wasn't the aroma of ostentatious wealth. It was the discreet scent of decades of care, planning, and secrecy. I adjusted the door to the side, revealing the interior. And at that moment, I saw their faces change. First came the shock, because inside there was no gold, jewels, shiny bars, or anything cinematic. There was something much more powerful and much harder to contest. There was paper, but not just any roll. There, meticulously arranged, were transparent folders with bank documents, envelopes with old deposit slips, contracts off financial investments and investment funds, documents of properties, land, contributions, copies of tax returns showing modest growth year after year, and above all, some older envelopes with names written by hand, names they knew very well, theirs. "What is all this?" murmured one of the sons, taking a step forward. Another, unable to contain his curiosity, took a deep breath. "Dad, are these investments?" I didn't need to answer. The words were there, printed, stamped, signed. Each line, each number, each official letterhead spoke a truth that none of their jokes could erase. I was never the financial loser they thought I was. My wife put her hand to her mouth as if trying to contain her astonishment. Her gaze darted from one paper to another, trying to decipher what she saw. That's a lot of money," she whispered, almost voicelessly. Yes, it was a lot of money. Not a movie fortune. Not something unreal. It was the result of decades of effort, discipline, and decisions made in silence. It was savings made when I stopped, buying things for myself, when I wore old clothes to pay for my studies, when I denied myself luxuries to ensure stability. I reached out and took one of the folders. I opened it slowly. I showed them a few pages, recent statements, round numbers that caught their attention on their own. There were investment accounts they didn't even know existed, funds in banks they never imagined I'd be able to look into, investments with values that, added together, exceeded any image they had of me. "Since when?" my oldest son began, but the question died unfinished. He held up a piece of paper, read a line, and the air of superiority he always wore when talking about money vanished. If before he looked at me as a burden, now he looked at me as someone who was on a level he hadn't anticipated. "Is this in my name?" he asked in a whisper. I nodded. "Not just in yours." I grabbed another stack of documents. I handed it to my daughter. She looked at the first page and it took her a few seconds to believe it. That's in my name, too." Her eyes darted to the bottom of the page, where there was a beneficiary field filled with her full name. Then she flipped through the following pages: insurance policies, investments, joint accounts that had never been touched by anyone but me. And yet, she was the beneficiary. My middle son received another folder. He opened it as if he were afraid of what he would find. He found what he least expected. "This here." He took a deep breath. "This here is property?" "Yes," I replied. "A plot of land. It's appreciated quite a bit in recent years." He continued reading, trying to piece the facts together in his head. At the bottom of the page, once again, the name listed as the recipient in case of death was his own. The grandchildren, not quite understanding, asked, "Mom, what is this? Dad, what's going on?" But the answers weren't coming. My children were too busy with their own shame, their own disbelief, their own internal narrative breakdown. Because the story they told about me for years was simple. Our father doesn't understand money. Our father has no future. Our father depends on us. Now the sheets of paper were shouting something else. Our father always understood planning. Our father built a future. Our father was always protecting us. I grabbed one of the oldest envelopes, yellowed at the edges. I opened it carefully. Inside were letters. I had written many of them by hand, on nights when the whole house was asleep, and I needed to talk to someone, even if that someone was the future. Letters addressed to each of my children, words from a father preparing for the day when he might no longer be there to explain everything. I showed one of them to my daughter. On the front of the envelope there was only, "For my daughter, if one day I am no longer here." She brought her hand to her mouth again, this time with tears in her eyes. She didn't dare open it. Not yet. I went back to the safe and pulled out a stack of stapled documents. "This here," I said, "is what changes the destiny of the entire family." They drew closer. Now there wasn't a single joke, not a single smirk, no mockery, just open, attentive eyes, some filled with fear, others with regret. It was the first time in a long time that they looked at me as someone who truly matters, as someone who has weight, as someone who actually makes a difference. I placed the papers on a box and opened the first one. These are the main assets, all declared, everything up to date, nothing dirty, nothing hidden from the government, nothing illegal. I've spent my life hearing that I was naive, that I didn't understand the world. But the truth is, while you were calling me outdated, I was building this. I pointed to the pages. They leaned over to see, and then I uttered a phrase that struck them like a bolt of lightning. "Almost everything here," I said slowly, "is in your names." The reactions were instantaneous. "What do you mean?" the older one stammered. "That doesn't make sense," the one in the middle murmured. "Wait," the youngest said. "You saved all this for us?" I nodded. From the beginning. It may have been the first time in many years that they saw me as I truly am. Not the outdated father, not the tired old man, not the man without a future, but someone who planned ahead, who thought beyond his own time, who sacrificed to create a protective barrier around them, exactly theirs. The same people who, that night, called me a burden. The same people who laughed at my lack of future. The same people who humiliated me without a second thought. I took a deep breath. "While you were pointing me out as a failure," I continued, my voice firm, "I was dedicating every penny, every overtime hour, every late night to ensure that you would never lack anything. This safe doesn't exist because of me. It exists because of the family, because of who you are, and ironically, because of who you have become." No one answered, because at that moment, any answer would have been too small. The garage, cold and full of old things, was now the center of the greatest truth they had ever faced about me. And I, with the vault door open and my life laid bare on paper, knew. From that point on, nothing would be hidden anymore. Not even what I did for them. Not even what they did to me. The safe was open. The garage was silent. And my children, grown adults, successful, proud, so quick to point out my flaws, now seemed smaller than ever. Not physically, but emotionally. It was as if the weight of the truth was pushing each of them inward, crushing the pride they had carried for years. I took a deep breath. This wasn't a moment of victory. It wasn't about revenge. It was about finally revealing what I'd hidden for decades. Not out of fear, not out of shame, but out of love. A love they never knew how to see. I looked at each face. Wide eyes, half-open mouths, restless hands, shame beginning to take shape. So I spoke, calmly, without shouting, without accusing anyone, without raising your voice, simply telling the truth that was kept hidden there, among papers, dust, and silence. I always saved money. I placed my hand on one of the folders and lifted it slowly. You thought I didn't know how to take care of anything, that I was always lost, that I didn't understand the modern world. But I always knew how to save. From my first paycheck when I was only 17 years old. From my first job where the salary barely covered food. From before you were born. They listened, without blinking. The youngest daughter was wringing her hands, restless. The older one bit the corner of his mouth, embarrassed. The middle son looked away, as if he wanted to escape his own conscience. I saved very little, I continued. Very little. Sometimes it was coins. Sometimes a few coins. Sometimes I skipped lunch so I could save 5 riets. Sometimes I accepted grueling overtime just to save a little. More. You never saw me do this, but I did it every day. I picked up another folder. This is the result of almost half a century of saving, slowly, silently, with discipline. The word discipline hung in the air. It was the word they always said I didn't have. Now, there it was, printed in numbers. I planned for the family's future. I picked up the envelope with the properties. Do you think you lived the way you did because life was easy? Life was never easy. I worked so that you wouldn't realize how difficult it was. My wife, who had been silent until then, put her hands to her face. She always knew I saved money, but she never knew how much. She never knew the extent of it. She never knew the size of the safety net I was building for everyone. My children seemed to be breaking inside. I continued. You studied at the best schools I could afford. You took courses, went on trips, had good school supplies, good clothes, good food. You never lacked anything. Nothing. Do. You know why? I tapped the safe twice with my fingers. Because I planned everything. Every year. Every penny. Every risk. Every emergency. And when I had the chance to invest, I invested. When I had the opportunity to learn something new, I learned it. When I could buy a property, I bought it. All with one thing in mind, your future. One of them murmured, I had no idea. I sighed. I know, because you never asked. That sentence fell on them like molten lead. I worked quietly to ensure that nothing was ever lacking. I pulled out another stack of documents. Old bank statements, paid bills, financial plans. While you were saying I was a burden, I was making sure I would never be a burden to anyone. While you were laughing and saying I had no future, I was building your future. While you were saying I didn't know how to take care of myself, I was taking care of everyone. Now there was no longer any doubt. Their expressions were a perfect portrait of shame, deep shame, those that can't be hidden. My oldest son, the proudest one, finally let his pride subside a little. Dad, all of this, why? Why didn't you ever say anything? I stared at him for a few seconds. Then I replied, because true love doesn't advertise itself. Because a father's sacrifice is not an advertisement. Because I didn't want to raise children who only value those who show off. I wanted to raise children who value those who get things done. They swallowed hard. All, without exception. You despise the very person who did the most for you. I didn't say it angrily, she said with pain. An old pain. A pain they unknowingly planted over the years. You spent your lives calling me outdated, tired, and hopeless. And yet, I put food on the table. I paid your bills. I supported you when the world fell apart. And when you grew up, you continued to treat me as if I were worthless. My voice wasn't trembling, not because I didn't feel it, but because I was finally free from carrying this burden alone. Today, you discovered that the one you humiliated at the Christmas table was precisely the one who did the most for you. No one answered. There was no defense. There was no justification. There was no excuse that could be accepted in that situation. I closed the folder. I never asked for much. I never asked for recognition. I never asked for gratitude. I only asked for one simple thing, respect. And you never gave it. Tears began to appear. First, discreet. Later, they became more open. My children couldn't face the safe, not me. There was a chasm between who they thought I was and who I really was my whole life. And at that moment, for the first time in years, I saw something break inside them. Pride. The arrogant pride that blinded everyone. Pride that turned love into a joke. The pride that made them believe they knew everything about me. Now the truth was there, laid bare on the makeshift table made of old boxes. A truth so great that it could no longer fit inside the safe. And in the depths of the silence, there was another question, unspoken, but visible in everyone's eyes. What have we done with the man who did everything for us? The silence that filled the garage after the revelation seemed almost physical, like an invisible wall between me and them. It was strange. My children, who always had a ready answer, a quick joke, a sharp criticism, now seemed lost within their own silence. Each processed the truth in their own way, some with their gaze lost in the, stacked papers, others staring at the floor as if searching for an explanation. Shame spread through the air like a strong, impossible-to-ignore smell. Then, finally, someone spoke. As always, the first one was the oldest, the one who had made the cruel toast. "Dad," he began, swallowing hard, "all that on the table was just a joke. We were just, I don't know, trying to be light-hearted." Joke. The word echoed in my head. Immediately afterwards, the youngest daughter, still with tears in her eyes, tried to follow along. "Yeah, Dad, you took it all too seriously. We didn't mean any harm. It's Christmas. Nobody wanted to hurt you." She tried to smile, but the smile died halfway through. The one in the middle, always arrogant, added, "You exaggerated a bit, didn't you? We were just joking. You could have said something sooner. You could have explained all of this. It didn't need to get to this point." The justifications began to pile up, one on top of the other, as if speaking faster would lessen the guilt that now burned inside them. "It was just a joke, Dad. You know we say these things while laughing. We never took that seriously. We talk, but it's not what we feel. You got hurt over a small thing. We didn't know anything about this. They weren't speaking to convince me. They spoke in an attempt to convince themselves that they weren't as cruel as they had been, and perhaps that's why the sound of their voices seemed empty. One by one, he tried to justify himself. One by one, they tried to change what had been said. But time doesn't go back, and the words spoken, once uttered, do not disappear. They remain in the crevices of the soul, waiting for the right moment to reappear. I stood there, next to the safe, listening to everything, without interrupting, without accelerating, without arguing back, and most importantly, without lowering myself. They continued, "Dad, seriously, you always took everything too literally. We say it jokingly, but we love you. You ruined the night, Dad. We never imagined. You should have told me." My wife tried to silence some of them with small glances, but even she was lost, caught between shock, guilt, and the fear that things had gone too far. When they finally stopped talking, not because they had run out of excuses, but because they realized that none of them made any difference, I took a deep breath. I nodded slowly, and I spoke, not angrily, not with hatred, not in a loud voice, but with that hard, firm, unwavering calm that only exists when the pain has been overcome and turned into clarity. "I'm not going to yell," I began, looking at each of them. "I'm not going to raise my voice. I don't want to fight. I'm not here to humiliate anyone. I'm not like you treated me at the table." They lowered their eyes. I continued, "But I want you to understand one thing. That wasn't a joke. Not at that moment. Not the way it was said. Not in that tone. Not with those words." The youngest daughter wiped away her tears, trembling. "Dad, I'm sorry. We didn't," he tried to say. I gently raised my hand, asking for silence. "You can say it was a joke. You can say you didn't take it seriously. You can say I exaggerated, but the truth is simple. You despised me." The older man looked up, alarmed. "It wasn't contempt, Dad. It was contempt," I interrupted without raising my voice. "It was when they laughed at my age. That's when they laughed at my clothes. That's when they said I was a burden. That's when they said I had no future. That's when they toasted to my failure. That's when they talked about me as if I wasn't there. They stood there, like children caught doing something forbidden. And the worst part," I continued, "is that you said that without knowing my life, without knowing my efforts, without knowing what I've built for you, without knowing what I've kept, protected, and planned for decades." My middle son tried desperately to change course. "Dad, we were just playing because it's customary, because it's always been this way." I looked at him calmly. If it's always been this way, then it's always been wrong. He couldn't answer. None of them succeeded. My heart was heavy but not broken. I had already broken it back there, at the table. Now it was just a matter of firmness. "I wasn't expecting applause," I said. "I wasn't expecting recognition. I never asked for people to say I was a good father. I never asked for thanks. I only asked for one simple thing. I took a step forward. The silence grew even deeper. I just wanted respect. The word came out harshly. Not because I yelled. I didn't need to yell. It was heavy because it was true. Because that was exactly what was missing. Because it was something so small. And even so, they never offered it. I looked at the open safe, and then at them. I thought, my voice came out lower, that you needed to know who I really am. My oldest son finally let his pride down. The tears streamed down slowly. "Dad," he said, crying, I didn't know." I took a deep breath. "You never wanted to know." The words resonated in a profound way, impossible to ignore. And there, in that cold garage, among old boxes and documents that would change the family's destiny, a new silence was born. No longer the silence of tension, but the heavy silence of regret. That kind of regret that can't be hidden behind excuses. That kind of regret that no one forgets. The garage remained, silent, as if the air had become too heavy to move. Each of my children now carried a new weight. The weight of revelation, the weight of regret, the weight of broken pride. And I, standing before the open safe, knew that this was the moment, the decision. Whatever I took there would change everything, their future, mine, the meaning of that night. I took a deep breath and slowly closed the safe door without locking it yet. The sound of metal echoed through the garage like a final warning. Everyone looked up at me. Now no one tried to justify themselves, no one tried to interrupt me, no one dared to make a joke. They knew. What was coming next wouldn't be light. My fingers traced the cold surface of the vault, as if I were running my hand through my own history. Decades of sacrifices, decades of silence, decades of decisions no one saw, but which sustained their lives. I took another deep breath. It was time to turn the tables. The question didn't come from their mouths, but it was etched in every glance. Fear, anxiety, insecurity, and a pang of guilt that burned deep inside. The oldest, the proudest, tried to ask, but his voice failed him. "Dad, what are you going to do?" I didn't answer immediately. I walked over to the counter where there were some old boxes and pulled one out, opening it on the surface. Inside were the most important documents: insurance policies, deeds, inheritances, retirement plans, properties. The youngest daughter approached hesitantly. "Are you going to tamper with the will?" The middle son took a deep breath. "Dad, don't do anything out of anger. No, you don't need to change anything today." I slowly raised my eyes to them. Today, you revealed who you really are when you think you have an easy target. And I revealed who I really am when you think I'm finished." They swallowed hard. I continued. "So yes, after everything that happened, I made a decision. The air seemed to freeze. I picked up one of the folders and tapped it lightly, with my fingers, as if marking a period. For years, I began, I planned to leave everything to you equally. Everything, without exception. Land, investments, money, documents, reserves, savings. I always thought the fairest thing was to divide it equally, because I always wanted to avoid fights, avoid disputes, avoid resentment. They remained motionless like statues. But tonight showed me something I didn't want to see. It showed that you've grown up, but you haven't matured. It showed that you still think you can step on someone just because you believe they're weak or old or outdated. It showed that respect has never been part of your choices. The words pierced them like thin blades. They weren't bleeding on the outside, but on the inside, each one was cutting. "And that's why," I continued, "the future needs to change." The youngest daughter held her hands together as if trying to stop them from trembling. "Dad, please, don't take us out of the—" She hesitated. "The will." The older man closed his eyes as if awaiting a verdict. I let the silence linger for a few seconds. They deserved to feel the weight of the moment. They deserved to feel the impact of their own actions. Then I said, "I'm not going to remove anyone from the will." They sighed, some with relief, others with confusion. But I continued, "I'm not going to keep things as they were either. I can no longer pretend that we're the harmonious family I imagined. I can't continue with an old plan when you've shown me today that you don't even know how to handle a conversation, let alone an entire legacy." Eyes turned to look up again. intense. I've spent my life thinking about your future, I continued, and I still do. But from now on, the future I plan for you will have the conditions. The daughter was confused. Conditions? Absent. Yes. Limits. Responsibilities? Consequences. The oldest one stepped forward. Dad, are you saying that you're going to control everything? I let out a soft sigh. No, I'm saying I'm going to protect what I've built, even if it means protecting you from yourselves. Their expressions changed. Now, it wasn't just regret. It was fear. Fear of what was to come. The new plan, I picked up a thick blue folder containing the documents I had been reviewing for months. Starting today, I announced, I'm going to rewrite the will. I'm going to include clear clauses, mature, responsible. You won't receive everything at once. You won't receive it just because you carry my last name. You won't receive it because you think you're entitled to it. They looked at each other, unsure how to react. I continued. They will receive it because they deserve it. They will receive it when they demonstrate respect, maturity, and true unity. Not just in front of others, not just when no one is watching. They will receive it when they stop treating those who love them as if they were disposable. The youngest daughter let a tear fall. Dad, we made a mistake. I shook my head. You've been wrong for years. Today it's just become impossible to hide. None of them tried to deny it. None of them tried to contest it. Now the truth had a face. I closed the folder and placed it on top of the open safe. I will continue helping the family. I will always be here. But the difference is that now there are limits. Limits that you never had, because I was always the father who held everything together, the father who solved everything, the father who absorbed everything. I swallowed my emotion and continued. Today, you're going to learn that a father is not a punching bag. He's not a target. He's not a joke. He's not an object of mockery. A profound silence fell over the garage. And most importantly, I concluded, fathers aren't eternal. And when I'm gone, I want to leave behind something you'll honor, not something you'll take for granted. They lowered their heads, not just out of shame, but because they knew that this was the hardest truth they had ever heard. I looked at the safe, then at them. The family's future changes now, not out of resentment, but for justice. For the first time in a long time, I choose to take care of myself too, and only then take care of you. The youngest daughter whispered, almost voicelessly, Dad, we promise we'll change. I gave a slight smile, not ironically, relief. Well then, because this time the legacy is in the hands of those who respect it, not just those who inherit it. And at that moment, for the first time that night, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Control. It was my moment. And I finally turned the tables. The garage, which earlier that night had seemed like just a forgotten storage room, now carried the weight of decades of unearthed truths. My children were still there, each sitting or leaning against some corner, as if their bodies had lost their strength after so many layers of pride had been forcibly ripped away. The safe remained open, like a cold mirror reflecting everything they never wanted to see. My effort, my sacrifices, my love, and the ingratitude they always tried to justify as just a joke. I took a deep breath. That was no ordinary ending. It was a start, tough but necessary. I walked to the garage door and left it ajar. The cool night air slowly drifted in, carrying with it the smell of damp earth and the distant sound of fireworks. Some neighbor celebrating Christmas, unaware that inside that house, an entire family was undergoing a transformation as profound as a silent earthquake. I looked at them one by one. This time, they didn't look away. There was nowhere left to run. The youngest daughter wiped away the tears that insisted on falling. The middle child bit the inside of his cheek, fighting against his own shame. The oldest kept his head down, as if he were in front of a mirror that forced him to confront the worst version of himself. And then I spoke. Not with resentment, but with clarity. Not with anger, but with firmness. I know this Christmas will forever be etched in your memories, not because of the dinner or the laughter or the jokes, but because, for the first time, you saw who I truly am, and you saw who you were becoming. They remained motionless, quiet, as if they were breathing the bare minimum. I continued. You spent years believing that worth is measured by clothing, apparent youth, and the way you speak. You thought that what matters is having style, technology, status, but you forgot the most important thing, character. And they also forgot a simple truth. I took a few steps to the center of the garage. My voice came out firm, filled with a wisdom that only someone who has carried a lot of weight in life can possess. A person's true worth is never in their appearance, but in the silent sacrifices that no one sees. The words echoed in an almost whisper, but struck each of them with the force of a belated revelation. You saw the surface of my life and judged the depths. You laughed at what seemed old, failed, outdated. You laughed at the clothes I wear repeatedly, my calm demeanor, the old stories. But you forgot to look at what really mattered. You forgot to see the father who worked all night, so that you wouldn't have to work so early. The man who saved every penny, so that you could have an education, food, and a safe roof over your head. The man who built an entire future, while you called me someone without a future. I paused for a moment. None of them were breathing heavily or making any sudden movements. They simply listened, perhaps for the first time in their lives. Today, I continued, the story changes. I'm no longer the father who bows his head. I'm no longer the man who accepts everything in silence. I'm no longer the butt of jokes at the Christmas table. My tone changed. Now there was strength, the strength of someone who finally recognizes their own worth. Today, I am someone you will respect, not because I have money, but because you finally saw what you never wanted to see, my truth. My wife's expression, standing beside me, had also changed. She seemed to see something in me that she might have forgotten or never fully noticed. I walked back to the safe, touched the open door, and closed it calmly. Then I locked the mechanism with firm movements. The metallic sound echoed through the garage like the end of a chapter that had gone on for far too long. This safe doesn't represent wealth, I explained. It represents every sleepless night I spent, every overtime hour, every backache, every sacrifice, every request I didn't make, every "it's okay" I said when it wasn't. The children began to cry without trying to hide it. Heavy, deep tears that came from the place where guilt meets conscience. I don't want perfection, I said calmly. I never did. I just wanted respect. And today, for the first time in many years, I felt that I can finally demand it. The older one took a hesitant step closer, as if asking permission to be near me again. "Dad," her voice faltered, we got lost. We didn't see you. Not the right way. I'm sorry. Truly sorry." His youngest daughter joined him. "We promised to be a family, but we forgot to honor you as a father." I took a deep breath. I didn't need to say that I forgave them. Forgiveness, when it is born even before the word. But I also wasn't going to let that whole moment end as if it were just a passing drama. No, that Christmas would not be forgotten. That Christmas would mark the beginning of a new family, more mature, more aware, more respectful, and more true. "You don't need to promise me anything," I finally said, with a slight, tired smile. "You just need to be better. To me, to each other, to yourselves." They nodded, still emotional, like children who finally understand the value of their own actions. I closed my eyes for a second and let the cool night air fill my lungs. When I opened it, I felt something new inside me. Peace. Not that feigned peace of someone who swallows their pain, but the peace of those who have been seen, heard, acknowledged. A kind of peace I hadn't felt in years, perhaps decades. I looked at my family, still shaken but transformed, and smiled. "Let's go back inside. Dinner's still there, and I think—" I paused. "Maybe it's a good time for a fresh start." They accompanied me in silence, but now there was a different kind of silence, a respectful silence, a silence that spoke louder than any words could. As we walked down the hall back to the dining room, I felt that the house was no longer the same. Neither do we. That Christmas, which began with humiliation, ended with a truth that no one would ever forget. A Christmas that will forever leave its mark. If this story captivated you, leave a like and subscribe. It helps me continue bringing you profound and truthful stories like this one. And he comments, "What would you have done in his place?"